Good afternoon. My name is Wilmarie Newton, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We will be answering your questions at the end of the presentation, so please hold your questions until then, at which time you can submit them by clicking on the question icon. If you have further questions after the webinar has ended, please feel free to email them to me and I will forward them to the appropriate person that can answer them. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on CABE's website under Professional Development. And now I'd like to introduce Patrice McCarthy, Executive Director and General Counsel for CABE.
Thanks so much, Wilmarie, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this very important webinar as part of our School Finance Seminar Series. We are happy to be able to present this due to the support of the State Department of Education and the Connecticut Association of School Business Officials, CASBO. This afternoon, we are going to focus on how the budget is developed, adopted, and the oversight role of the Board of Education. And we have a very distinguished panel of experienced superintendents and school business officials that are going to walk us through this session this afternoon. I'm happy to turn it over to them. Gentlemen.
Go, Mark.
Thank you. This is an auspicious start, guys. Mark, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'll kick us off. I'm Mark Benigni, proud superintendent of Meriden Public Schools. This is year 15 for me in this role in Meriden.
Mike.
Hi, this is Mike Grove, Assistant Superintendent of Meriden Public Schools. I've been working with Mark in Meriden for the last 15 years.
And I'm Vin Massian. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the Cheshire Public Schools. Also, coincidentally, in my 15th year with the school district, and presently working on my 16th budget. So we're already deep into the woods on 25-26 budget development. Jeff?
And good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jeff Sullivan, Superintendent of the Cheshire Public Schools. This is my 9th year as superintendent, and it's year number 20 for me working in Cheshire. We're really honored to be here with you today. We hope that we can provide some insight into both how suburban and urban districts design and go through the budget process, but really more importantly for most of our viewers, how the board is engaged in that process, not only through the adoption process, but monitoring after adoption and how they can be invested and support the school system and the community in that way. I also would indicate that while we're conducting the webinar today, and certainly we're happy to field questions at the end, all 4 of us are responsive. If you have a question after the fact, don't hesitate to shoot us an email or give us a call.
And I'd just like to let everyone know that I will be guiding and driving this presentation. So we will be going back and forth, talking a little bit about our respective school districts and some of the similarities and some of the differences, not only in the district, but in the budget, the way it's developed and adopted as well. So we're going to jump right in and start with an overview of the Meriden Public Schools. Mark?
Sure, thanks, Vin. And Meriden features 13 schools, 8 elementary, 3 middle, and 2 high schools. We also have 3 associated programs, the Venture Academy, Success Academy, and our CCC program. We have about 8,800 students. 79% of our students identify as students of color. 78% of our students qualify for free or reduced price meals. However, we're universal free breakfast and lunch. If you're hungry, you eat, and there's no stigma to getting a breakfast and lunch. 21% of our students are in special education, and 17% of our learners are multilingual.
I think I might have jumped a little bit here. Sorry about that, Dr. Sullivan.
That's all right. In the Cheshire Public Schools, we're literally half the size of the Meriden Public Schools, and you can see that the number of buildings is obviously reflected in that size discrepancy. The State Department of Education many years ago put together a district reference group or an economic reference group We were considered DIRG B at that time, and then the Connecticut School Finance Project just recently updated that. We're still in that district reference group B. Just for a point of reference, district reference group A is really Fairfield County, the more affluent communities in Connecticut. The Connecticut School Finance Project recently added Madison to that list. And then, like I said, we're in DIRG B. And Mark, you guys, what's your district reference group?
We're one up from the bottom, so H.
Yeah, so a lot of school systems, and you'll see in the presentation today, like to look at how are we performing relative to our peers. And I think that's a good way for school systems to take a look at, what are those with similar backgrounds in their communities and similar resources, how are we performing against them? And I think, I know Mark is justifiably proud, as am I, about our performance and the way that our board operates in our relative peer groups.
Yeah.
So when we talk, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about this, Vin, or do you want me to hop right in?
No, I mean, I'll just kind of highlight here before we move to the next section. So the broad budget responsibilities that, we collectively have is to ensure that budget meets some important district goals, its core values, the vision, mission of the district, community needs, and the economic realities. So, while a budget is, financial instrument, it's really grounded in, what is the district's vision and mission? And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about over the next few slides.
Yeah, you've probably heard that the budget is a reflection of your principles. The budget is a reflection of your values.
And for Meriden, our guiding principle is, regardless of socioeconomic status or prior learning experiences, all students must be able to access digital resources to expand their world. We look at our core values. One, we must recognize that all of our students learn differently, as well as our staff. And voice and choice matters. It matters to our students and our staff. Learning spaces need to be flexible to meet students where they're at. And we must embrace this concept of anytime, anywhere learning. We know that learning does occur outside the classroom walls, and we need to know how we can recognize that, account for that, and give students the opportunity to experience learning more than 6 hours a day, 180 days a year. We work closely with the Barr Foundation to create a portrait of a graduate. Ours is a community-driven portrait of a graduate. These are the skills and our competencies that our students are going to need to be successful later in life. And you see there, I am a learner, I'm a thinker, I'm an advocate, I'm a collaborator, and most importantly, I'm prepared for life after high school. And those are kind of the documents that guide our work and are discussed as we carve out our budget requests to the city.
So similarly, Cheshire starts with our mission that in partnership with families in the community, prepare all students to meet the challenges of an ever-changing global society by providing high-quality educational opportunities that inspire lifelong learning and service to others. As Mark said, this is, our foundational mission that guides our work. But like Meriden, we also have a portrait of the graduate and have adopted targets for our students. Ben, if you want to move along to the Cheshire performance standards, are more global targets that we have for our students. So we've identified students as evolving and becoming complex thinkers, collaborative cooperative workers, community contributors, creative thinkers, effective communicators, and self-directed learners. Now this was identified, as well as the next slide that you'll see that outlines our core goals of supporting students to become complex thinkers and strong social emotional learners. Ben, if you want to move to that slide. We identified these things through a comprehensive process, like Mark mentioned, the Barr Foundation. We met with local business folks. The Board of Education started with a retreat with our board, met with local business leaders, met with students, met with parents, various PTO meetings, our teaching staff, administrative staff, and really tried to distill down what is it that's really important for us as a school system. That's what the board ultimately adopted, and we use this as a lens to make decisions around our budget process.
So yeah, as we're just going to reiterate the point that the budget, it provides this financial support to meet our academic, our administrative, and certainly our operational goals, but always grounded with the core values, vision, mission, and community needs and economic realities. So, you know, board members do play an active role in the development of those core values that the district has. And, you know, each year the boards do meet and reaffirm those plans as we do here in Cheshire. We're going to keep moving on and talk a little bit about the considerations that impact the budget that are more on a financial note. And just to name them, unfunded mandates certainly have an impact that we have to consider when we develop the budget. Student enrollment, which will show you some examples of how we do that. In Cheshire in particular, special education costs a large component of all district budgets, usually, you know, 25% or more of the total budget is expended on special education needs. Community support, you know, general inflation obviously is more of a factor in the last 3 years than it has been in the previous, you know, 5 to 10 years. Rising healthcare costs, and we separate that out because healthcare has its own inflation above the general inflation rate generally. And then increased costs for operations and maintenance, you know, and that includes our utility and fuel costs, you know, which have been going up in recent years. And with that, we'll talk in detail about some of the considerations, and, you know, I'll turn this over to Mike and Mark on Meriden.
Thanks, Vin. And I'd say that I've been fortunate in my 15 years here. I've worked with terrific board members, strong board leaders who are always looking to make sure that they're supporting and creating a budget that can meet the needs of all of our students. And one of the things they really want us to look at are what are those unanticipated expenses? What are those things that we can't perfectly plan for? And are we making sure that we have the resources to support the needs of our students? And for us in Meriden, our bilingual and ELL enrollment over the last 4 years, we've gone up 717 students in bilingual or ELL programs. That's larger than any of our elementary schools. It's also larger than 2 of our 3 middle schools. You can go back to the other slides, Bob. We also look at, in special education, the cost of students who we know are in district that we already currently have outplaced. We try to get figures, how much are those outplacements going to increase their cost? What are those costs going to be? In this year's budget, we knew we had 44 students who attended schools with a tuition of $100,000 or more. We knew what those costs would be with transportation. And I'll share later how we estimate what we may get back in excess costs, but obviously these are key cost drivers that we need to be prepared for. Something new that we started doing is we're looking at, we have a more transient population, so people are coming and going more in Meriden, and part of that's based on the housing availability here in the city. We're looking at students who may move to Meriden during the year, but they're already outplaced. Well, if they're already outplaced and they move to Meriden, we're going to have to cover those costs. So we had 9 students last year move. That was an unanticipated Board of Ed expense of $722,000. In future budgets, we're going to have to make sure that we're accounting for the likelihood of students moving here who are going to come with direct cost associated to them. I know all districts dealt with this last year. We can apply to the state for reimbursement for a portion of the cost for those students that we are spending significant dollars on. It was expected to be at 91%. In actuality, it was only at 71%. So for Meriden, that was a decrease of $569,754 that we thought we'd get back in excess costs that never made it to our coffers. Go to the next slide.
Yeah.
One back.
One more back. We also have a significant population of students who are homeless or become homeless. And in 22-23, we bused 24 homeless students who were living outside of Meriden for a cost of $248,000. This past year, we had 34 homeless students, and the cost was $372,000 to bus them back to school in Meriden. So there might not be a housing option. They're homeless here in Meriden. They may be living in another community. We need to get them to our schools and pay a portion of those costs. And you see the difference. So when we do our budget, we need to make sure that we're planning for that. We're planning for a potential increase in students, but we're also planning for an potential increase in transportation cost. All of us have been experiencing some transportation challenges, shortage of drivers. That's driven up prices, so we need to make sure that we're equating those costs into our budget. Next slide. Another factor is health insurance, and obviously this is a large budget driver. We saw an increase of 1.6 million. The way it works here in Meriden is we pay the city directly for our health insurance. The city's self-insured, but we pay for the increases, and those increases are based on actual expenses, and our rate this past year went up 12.5%. So a large increase in our budget that we needed to make sure that we requested in our budget.
And similar to Meriden, we've seen large increases in medical insurance costs. Cheshire, both the town and the board are self-insured. We do work together with the town to negotiate with our vendors. But we, unlike Meriden, we budget and pay for our health insurance costs directly. And you can see here that our budget for this fiscal year that we're in is 14.3 million. That was an increase of a little over $1 million, which is a 7.95% increase over that prior year for this line item. But I will tell you the $1 million increase here was a little bit more than a third of our total budget increase for the year. So, you know, health insurance costs are a substantial component of our budget, and it's been increasing as a proportion of our budget over the years. I don't think it's unusual in any school district, or, you know, most corporations are struggling with the high cost of health insurance. So we're going to switch gears here a little bit and keep this moving. We're going to talk a little bit about the typical key participants in the budget process. You know, the budget generally begins in the school business office when you're looking at school districts. You know, so myself as the COO here in Cheshire, you know, Mike as you know, the business leader in Meriden, we're responsible for the overall development of the budget. We crunch all the numbers and we, you know, prepare the documents, but we work with the board and the superintendent, you know, to bundle the whole budget together. Our payroll supervisor is an important component. I do want to note that when we prepare our budgets, we are not just taking last year's payroll and adding 3% or 4%. We're going each employee based on their contractual raises that have been committed to. You know, most employees in schools are in a bargaining unit. So that is a line item that's budgeted very, very precisely. School principals and department heads, they have a role in putting recommendations towards the budget. Obviously, the superintendent, as we've discussed, sets the initial vision and ultimately recommends a budget to the Board of Education that's aligned with the strategic goals of the district. The Board of Ed's responsibility is to review the superintendent's budget, you know, and recommend changes as necessary. And ultimately, the board does vote to adopt a budget that moves to the fiscal authority, whatever that is. In each town and city is different. In Cheshire, you know, we do have a town council form of government. In Meriden, your form of government is about the same.
Yep, very similar, Vinny.
Yeah, you know, other districts have a board of finance. So, you know, there is a fiscal authority that ultimately approves the budget. The one thing that I will know about the fiscal authority's authority, they can approve a budget of a set dollar amount, but they don't have line item vetoes. So, you know, if the Cheshire Board of Education recommends an $85 million budget, you know, our town council can reduce it to 84 million, but it's ultimately the board's responsibility to apply that $1 million reduction and set the $84 million budget that's approved. We're going to talk quickly about timelines. You know, the budget process is actually quite a long process in school districts. I'm going to turn it right over to Mike to talk a little bit about the timeline in Meriden.
Sure. Thanks, Van. So in Meriden, our budget process is basically 9 months long. So over that time, we try to give as much chances for input from our staff and also from the community. So in October, all our department leaders and principals get a chance to put together their budgets and their requests. In November, myself and the director of finance for Meriden Public Schools will meet with each of the different administrators, gather their requests and put them together to bring to the superintendent. So in the November timeframe, we put together a budget with the superintendent, with Mark. We've been doing this for like 15 years. Once we have a budget that we're comfortable with as a district, we share it initially at a finance meeting in December. That's the first time the board really sees our budget. It's really an initial draft. There's a lot of numbers. We don't have health insurance yet. We're still working on factors from like, what are we gonna get from state grants, but it's an initial presentation. In January now, for last year and a couple years before, our board then takes this process on the road. We go to different schools in Meriden and we share the initial draft budgets. So our community has a chance to give us some input. The board has a chance for us to make adjustments during January into February. At the first board meeting in February, the Board of Ed has to submit a budget to the city council. So they vote in February and that's sent to the city council. In Meriden, that means that it goes to the city manager. The city manager then meets with the superintendent in March. And then later in March, the city manager puts out a city budget. That's his recommendation to the city finance committee. And then from that, before that goes, the district put together a presentation and Mark presents our budget, the Board of Ed budget, to the city finance committee. That all ends in March. And then we really have 2 months of, I would say, like negotiations or communications between board members and the city council. And then during that time frame, there's a liaison to the board, to the city council, and then through them, we'll get requests for information. So through April and May, we'll get requests for additional information about our budget. The superintendent will then hand that off to myself, and we get staff to answer their questions. First meeting in May, our city council votes on a budget. And then in June, we once again convene the board at a finance meeting, and we have to make any cuts or adjustments based on what Vin talked about before. Once the city council sets the budget, the city council really can't tell you how to spend the money, but they have the bottom line number, and we have to make sure that our budget meets and falls within that dollar amount.
Thanks, Mike. I won't belabor this much because our budget process timeline is very similar to Meriden. We begin in September. The process doesn't end till May, and May is when the Board of Education approves the final budget that the fiscal authority has appropriated for us for this fiscal year. So I'd like to say that it always feels like we're in budget season, pretty much because we always are in budget season. So, in May of 2024, even though the board's approved everything, we still have to go in and create a final budget book and share that with all our department heads so that they know what to manage. And in July, July 1, the new budget year starts every year. Some of the things that are real highlights that we do take into consideration as we're developing the budget, enrollment projections, those do drive a large component of the changes in staffing that we need year over year. This chart on the right, this is not unusual to any school district, but 81% in the case of Cheshire of our $89.5 million budget is for salaries and benefits. And again, as I mentioned, salaries are budgeted very carefully, employee by employee based on their, agreed upon, wage increases. And there's always a plus or minus because you do have turnover. And then employee benefits, in this case, 17.6 million, 20% of our budget, has been a growing component of our budget. So if 80% is salaries and benefits, which are, fairly fixed, then that doesn't leave a lot where you can, have room to make significant impact on the budget by, adding or reducing to those line items. Operational costs and program evaluations are what we do. So I have a couple of quick examples. This is a very busy slide. I get that. This is our elementary enrollment. The top portion of this chart is the current year we were in, and the bottom portion is the projections that we had for the following school year for elementary. So if you look all the way over to the right side, I just want to highlight 4 numbers. On the right in the middle, there's that number that's highlighted, 2,246 students. That was the current year's enrollment as we were developing the budget. And then if you look straight below that, we knew that our projected enrollment was going to go to 2,274 students. And so we had to move from 120 teachers in elementary to 121 elementary classroom teachers. So the projections essentially told us we needed to add 1 elementary classroom teacher. So that's what we do with enrollment. Again, this is just high level to give you an example of what happened, from last year into the current school year with enrollment. And then this document on the left side is the memo that we sent to all our principals, our administrators, our managers, directors, anybody who's responsible for inputting to the budget. You'll see that they had target dates to complete their work by, which was in October, and we had to work through and from October to January to get ready for the superintendent to present his budget to the board. And on the right side of this screen is just one of the new program request forms that we use here in Cheshire. And the goal of this is if a school such as the Cheshire High School, which is this example, they wanted to add last year a winter percussion program. So we don't allow them to just throw that number in their budget. This is a request that has to be submitted. It gets reviewed ultimately by the school superintendent. We do meet with the principals and the department managers on these types of new program requests and ultimately make a decision, yes or no, do we include it in the budget? If it's approved for inclusion, we then add it so that we have good control over the new things that are coming. And you could see on the form, they could be, not only new instructional programs, but it could be new technology or new equipment. The general guideline on this is it needs to be $5,000 or more for us to consider new programs or new costs. And the last point that I wanted to show you here, and by the way, a lot of these slides that you see come from our actual budget and internal documents. We didn't create them specifically for today's presentation. This is what we actually use. So this slide is the key budget assumptions that we shared with the board at the superintendent's presentation of what our budget was built around. It was a net enrollment growth of 56 students. Special education costs were increasing in line with enrollment growth. Cheshire's enrollment has been increasing over the last few years. Last year was unique in that we had ESSER funding, that was the COVID era funding that was expiring. And we had funded a few positions that we wanted to retain in the New Year's budget. So we had to include that as part of our expense increase. Medical benefits, and then operations and maintenance, we had higher utility and heating costs. So that kind of rounds out the budget assumptions that we had in Cheshire. And we're going to now go back to Meriden to talk a little bit about some of the impacts and the factors that they had influencing their budget.
Sure, thanks, Finn. And just like Cheshire, I think most districts, 85% of Meriden budget is to fund staffing, right? So staffing costs is our biggest factor. But what you'll see in this chart is the total educational budget for Meriden Public Schools. So last year, we had $145 million we received in 23-24. A budget is funded from like multiple different sources that you'll see on the right. Our biggest funder is the state through state grants, ECS, Alliance, and then there's smaller state grants. That's 76.2 million or 52%. Our city funds $48 million of our budget, or about 33%. So when in Meriden, when we go present our budget, and the people hear $145 million, a lot of times they say that's a lot of money. Like, we don't need any more money. So one thing we have done in the last couple of years is make sure we made that comparison to other districts around us. And there's two numbers that you'll see here, NCEP and PPE. Those are two ways the state calculates per pupil expenditures. And we make sure that our public knows that we're second to last on any NCEP, or we're third from the bottom on per pupil spending. It's just a way for us to make sure the public knows that, you know, we have a lot of money in our educational budget, but we still are not overly funded. So this year was unique to in past years because with the ARP funding going away, our board, when we received the $20 million, and we had $13 million being spent last year going away, they've been planning for this reduction. So we reduced 44 staff members from the ARP grant. They were hired on 3-year positions. So when we were out there promoting it to the public, we let them know that there was a plan in place. We just didn't lose 44 positions that are going to drastically affect our programming, but we had a phase-in plan over the last 3 years, how when this grant ended, that we were going to continue on. What else you'll see in this, we share with the city council, and we also share with our communities the different types of grants we receive besides, so you see all the federal grants on the left, all the smaller state grants on the right. You know, we also receive, because we're an Alliance district, Alliance funding, that's about 25 million, and then ECS funding comes directly to us like most districts. Because we don't, our pupil expenses is low, what our district has always done is go out and seek foundation funding. So if we partner with a lot of different foundations. This year, the Dalio Foundation, Athlete Foundation are two of the ones we're still partnering with. If the foundation's goals match our board goals, those are foundations that we will work with. There's many times it doesn't match or it doesn't align, and then the superintendent, we won't go after those grants or partner with those foundations. But if they do align and they're going to support our district goals, we found that the foundation funding has been very helpful. So what we do before we give it to the city council, we put together, working with the superintendent, our budget book, and our budget book has 3 sections. Our first sections, we always include the highlights of the district. What are our successes last year? You know, we're asking for over $100 million. We want to make sure people know that we did have success in our district and what we're proud of. So we share those. Our second section is on the factors that Mark talked about earlier, Superintendent Danny talked about, was different enrollment changes, staff changes, demographics, and any of the grants. We want to make sure people have the full story. And then our third section is the number breakdown. It's more of just the nuts and bolts of the budget.
Thank you, Mike. So this Cheshire does the same as Meriden. We develop a budget book when we begin, you know, the budget process to the board, and we're going to start migrating towards board responsibilities in the next section of our presentation. After the superintendent makes his initial presentation to the board and the community, we then have a series of workshops where we dive into different sections of our budget. We do certainly certified and non-certified salaries, benefits. You know, we do have a session on just special education costs. Then we talk about our instructional expenses, our support services that includes items like student transportation and operations and maintenance. And that usually takes 3 evenings. Those are meetings that are open to the public like they are in all school districts. And we do work really hard to put together not only a budget book that explains the budget and has a lot of detail, but try and summarize in our PowerPoint presentations, which we generally all use, to not only present the budget, but try and anticipate and explain in detail those items that are significant cost changes perhaps in the budget, whether they're expenses or reductions in our revenue accounts. And so now we begin talking a little bit more about board member responsibilities. Jeff?
Sure. So, I mentioned at the outset that, we thought it was important to talk about where the Board of Education interfaces. And this is the statutory outline of what is required as a duty of the Board of Education. And we like to remind board members, this is the bottom line. This is the basic version of what is required from board members. A lot of this is subjective, with respect to adequate instructional book supplies, etc. Equitable, balanced funding between schools that's appropriate based on needs in those buildings. Of course, proper maintenance of facilities in a safe school setting. But really beyond that, the board member responsibility as it relates to the budget is a 12-month endeavor. It doesn't just begin at the first budget meeting. The Board of Education responsibility is to interface with the superintendent and administration, the community, and identifying what are those core values that will ultimately be translated into a fiscal sense and into the budget. So it's really, like I said, a 12-month effort on the part of the board. From the superintendent's perspective, of course, we work with not just the board in the school system, but as Mark said, seeking grants, we interface with the state, we advocate a lot on behalf of the school system with respect to things like Mark said, the excess cost grants, and how do we communicate effectively with them to ensure that the school systems and the communities receive as much funding as possible to support the goals designed by the community and the needs of the students. So, how does the board support the budget adoption process? Certainly I could read through each of these, but I'll hit some highlights and ask Mark to also some things that he sees. With our board, we know, for example, last year there was somebody speaking at a board meeting in advance of our budget process about the desire to add fencing as a sport. So we identify this as, this is going to come up during the budget process. So when we see these things percolating in the community, whether it be through maybe some communication with board members or directly to the board at a meeting, it's behooves everybody to try and be on the same page and prepare for that as you go through the board process, pulling numbers together, etc. We're also working hard to identify, what are the goals that we have, and if we're making proposals for more resources, where do they align with our district goals, the goals that the community adopted, and how does that play out? What's our perceived benefit by adding this resource? How does it help us fulfill that goal? One thing I certainly want to underscore too, and I know this is the case obviously, when Mark and Mike are talking about their net current expenditure, PPEs being at the bottom of the district, Cheshire is 109th out of 166. We all are looking at efficiencies to the greatest extent possible. So when we're looking at, if we have to add something, or if we are suggesting, as we did in Cheshire this past year, that we wanted to try and bolster our complex thinking goal, by building in STEM opportunities for kids in grades 4 and 5. We have a pre-engineering and environmental science project or program now that all of our students can. How do we do that as efficiently as possible? We partnered with the Cheshire Ed Foundation, who helped support that goal. We made reductions in other places, unfortunately, based on enrollment to our program to try and be as efficient as we possibly can. Because I think a lot of times, you know, the Board of Education budget comes in and people on the outside don't see that those efforts were made. That can set you back. So I think it's really important to, as a board and an administrative team, to identify those places and make sure that you're educating the broader community. Mark, anything that I missed there you want to add?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think expressing some of the efficiencies, if we've had savings due to solar projects, let's recognize that savings and be clear that we were able to reduce costs there. Let's be upfront and honest. If we go up 80 students and they're not in specialized programs or requiring specialized services, 80 students in a district our size, we don't need additional teachers to meet those needs. Those 80 students are going to be spread out over 13 buildings, over different grade levels. So sometimes sharing and letting the board know that so they can share that with the city council. Like, we went up 220 students, but we didn't ask for any new teachers because these students weren't in specialized programs. Or we went up with 50 students, but they're requiring significant services under special education. That's why the cost is. So I think our board's been very active in helping to try to educate the council and working closely with the council, definitely sharing those efficiencies. Another thing that I think our board has taken a strong leadership role. Any infrastructure or operational improvements is going to be a cost borne by the city. Capital improvement projects, what the board does now is they'll do the initial study. They'll pay for it, they'll fund it, they'll work with us on getting that study. And then when they're asking the city to take on these projects, it's not just, we think we need it, it's a 20-year-old roof. It's, here's the study, here's the need. And I think that's worked very, very well, and probably has advanced some of our projects because the city now has accurate information from the board. So those are some of the ways that we've kind of worked closely, board and city council.
Yeah, I think, you know, in any economic environment, it's really important to be able to justify the investments that we're making in our kids and our community. And I think, as Mark is saying, you know, when you have a third-party evaluation, that's one way to justify an operational improvement or capital improvement, for example. But it might also be a third-party evaluation on the educational side. Maybe it's the NEASC accreditation visit. But it's also, I think, really important to year-round be really clear about what the organization's goals are. You know, I think everybody in our community knows that we are all in on supporting social emotional learning and complex thinking. So when people hear that this is an investment to support one of those goals, it's not foreign to them. They recognize this is a community adopted effort, and so, okay, there's a justification there, rather than, you know, like Mark said, that conveying the idea that this is just kind of like, hey, we think, because there can be so much of that in our line of work or budgeting where you're just kind of chasing the fad. No, this is something that's part of what we do. And then, of course, obviously, emergencies happen and things like that happen that you have to justify. None of us planned for COVID, you know, you have to just pivot sometimes, but that's part of the work. But the more you can justify these investments, I think the better off you are.
And Jeff, for us in Meriden, and I'm sure it's the same way for you in Cheshire, I think our Board of Education leadership team has always said, if the council asks for the information, get them the information. There's no surprises, there's no secrets here. Whatever you need, we're going to get to you so you can make the most informed decision when it comes down to making a determination on our budget. And I think also there's been a collaborative nature, especially over the last few years, where it's not a blame game. While we'll point out that we're the second lowest funded district in the state, we recognize why we got there. And this is something that's happened years and years. It's not the current elected leaders that put us here, but it's the current elected leaders that need to work together to make sure that we still provide a quality education for all of our students and we continue to move the district forward. And I think I applaud the board for their work with some of those partnerships with the city council.
All right, you gents are on a roll, so we've advanced to the next slide.
So I mean, once you get through the adoption process, which, you know, Vin and Mike walked through the timelines in our respective communities, the board, you know, like I said, it's a 12-month endeavor, the budget. So, you know, I think one of the things that might get lost sometimes that's important is the communication between the subcommittees of the board around what you're thinking. The first time that you're hearing that maybe the planning committee needs to add 2 portables is the case for Cheshire, you know, given our growing enrollment, shouldn't be, you know, the day before the budget meeting. You know, the planning committee needs to be communicating that to the broader board throughout the process in conjunction with the superintendent or the chief operations officer or whoever. You know, the fact that we're maybe looking at a new you know, textbook or, you know, reading program or whatever the case may be. I think a lot of that communication is really valuable, reinforcing again the goals of the school system. But then, you know, there's a monitoring process in place. I'm sure that each board meeting, everybody is, you know, getting an update, a regular update on where are we with respect to the board budget. And, you know, is everybody on the panel has said the lion's share of our budget comes from our staffing. So that you encumber at the beginning, there's very little discretionary money in our budgets. And so, you know, most districts will only release a portion of that discretionary money. So like the instructional supply budget, we'll set that cap at like 50% for, you know, when we release that in July. And we will gradually release more money throughout the year to ensure that, oh my gosh, we can't release all of our discretionary money and spend it by January 15th, only to have the worst winter we've ever had. Our snow budget goes through the roof, and now we don't have the money to pay the bills. So we're gradually releasing that money, and the board is involved in that process. They're aware of that process throughout the course of the year.
Yeah, very similar in Meriden. We have 2 board meetings a month, but we also have a committee meeting structure. So monthly, Mike is presenting our budget, sharing where we're at percentage-wise, where we should be at. And sometimes there's a reason why we're a little higher, our percentage is a little over what it typically is at this time of the year, but we share that with the finance committee so there's no surprises. And most importantly, they're wondering, well, how are you going to deal with that? And that's our job before the meeting to say, okay, well, we're a little over in this line. Maybe we have to show the board how we're going to pull back here to make matters work. Another thing that I should have probably mentioned on the previous slide, I think the board and the city council have done a good job of working together. So for locking in fuel rates, oil rates, recognizing those savings. So you may have a good year where not only do you not use as much oil, but you got a very advantageous rate that you locked into. We'll recognize that as a savings metrics as well.
And I'll add that the key point is actually the bottom bullet in this slide is that the board has to ensure that total expenditures do not exceed the approved total budget at year end. You know, under Connecticut law, in theory, board members are personally liable if you go over budget. And I do, and have told the boards here in Cheshire that that will never happen while I'm here because I do value my job and we're not going over budget. But the way, as Dr. Solon said, the way we manage our budget is that, you know, even though we've got an approved budget, we don't release all the funds until we get through, you know, 2/3 of the year where we have a good understanding of, you know, are we going to have any overages related to outplaced student tuition or some other surprise expense having to do with, you know, building repairs. But that is an important component that we do manage internally, you know, from the superintendent and the school business side. But, you know, we do update our boards, and it's you know, one of the more serious responsibilities that the board does have to ensure we meet the budget.
And we've frozen budget line items to make sure that we're in good shape for the end of the year. And again, I think it's explaining to the board, but it's also explaining to your school teams. This is why we're freezing, making sure that everyone understands that we're on the same page.
All right, I think we've concluded the presentation, and we're ready for questions and answers.
Great. So I do have a couple of questions here, but before we get into the questions, I want to draw everyone's attention to the chat. Jeff has shared a couple of documents from Cheshire, if you would like to take a look at that. Our first question is, can one of the presenters describe the minimum budget requirements set by the state?
How many think? I mean, so in Meriden, since we're an alliance district, we cannot receive less than we received the year before. So whatever the city portion of the budget, when we showed that slide before, there was, when we consider city, that's the city's portion is the ECS, but whatever the funding that we receive from the city combined, we cannot receive less than we received the year before. Because we're an alliance district. There's other rules. If you're not an alliance district, like if your population decreases by a certain amount, they're able to reduce it by a percentage. But in general, most districts, you cannot receive less money from the city combined with the ECS money than you received the year before.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that is, there are some provisions that if, for example, your student enrollment is decreasing, your budget can be decreased, but there are limits to how much that can done. But the theory is that the minimum budget requirement is set so that school districts aren't underfunded. That's the theory behind it. We've not been subject, or that hasn't happened since, Jeff and I have been here in Cheshire, but I know that is a reality for some communities and districts.
Yeah, the demographics in Connecticut, for most communities, there has been a decline in birth rates and enrollment. And so I know that's a real issue for some communities. I know that, from the perspective of where Meriden and Cheshire sits, we've kind of seen the opposite, taking place. So maintaining flat budgets with increasing enrollment can be particularly crippling because of the fact that our salaries, as we've mentioned, are the lion's share of our budget, and those are really subject to binding arbitration. And so, current settlements are coming in at about 4.5% a year. So to keep a flat budget for, even the Cheshire Public Schools, 4.5%, we know the salary has to go up 4.5%, bus contracts, everything else goes up. To keep it flat, the only way to potentially manage that is to cut significant staff. That's the reality. But I did share, I'm sure Will Marie will put it out in the chat. She probably already did, but there's information on the MBR from a minimum budget requirement from Connecticut State School Finance Project. It's a 2-page flyer that helps provide an overview of that in greater detail.
Thank you. And generally, how many pages are your budget books?
Yeah, you couldn't fire a bullet through our budget book because, the state requires budgets be put together in a certain format, and we I think in Cheshire over the years we haven't just presented the budget. There is a litany of supporting documents that go with that budget. For example, the history of teacher salary, contract salary in our district, dating back 20 years, the enrollment information, the staffing at each building. That's why I shared that link, so you can kind of get a sense of, not just the operating budget, but all the background information that goes into that operating budget. There's almost anything when we get a question, there's almost 100% certainty where you could say, yeah, it's in the back of the budget book, because it's so comprehensive for us.
So
Yeah, I mean,
Mary-
we're over 200 pages in just the core budget book. And we break it down into sections. So if you look at our certified salaries, that section's about 15 pages. Non-certified is about 15 pages. And then we have a very detailed line by line summary of each budget line item. And we have a couple of thousand line item accounts in our budget. Go ahead, Mike. I know I cut you off there.
that's right. I just posted our budget book. Ours is a lot shorter. We're about 55 pages that we submit over to the city council. That we have the same information that I think Cheshire does. We just don't package it all together. Certain city council members ask for more information, and then we'll share that with them. We have a bigger, bigger book that we keep internally, but for our budget book, it's about 50 to 60 pages a year.
Yeah, one of the common laments of school business managers is we're preparing 3 budgets. We have the superintendent's recommended budget, and that contains a set of numbers. And if the board revises, does not approve the superintendent's budget as requested, we prepare a second budget book, adjusting the numbers. And then ultimately, when the fiscal authority appropriates a budget and the board takes the appropriation and makes its final adjustments, that's the third iteration of the budget. So it's a lot of work, but it is, an essential part of communicating and being transparent with, the budget through its stages of development. We always post each version online so that it's always available for review. And when the budget is in final form, it just stays there till the following budget year.
Thank you. Our next question is, how do you handle additional special education students that came into your system after the budget has been approved? For example, you budgeted for 50 and you actually have 55 students.
I talked a little bit about, we withhold that money, the discretionary money. And this is why, because there are unforeseen circumstances where we may have to reapply resources in a different direction, whether it be new students into the district or, like I said, the worst snow season in history kind of thing. We budget, and there are a million different budget line items. And I think sometimes it's hard for people to understand, but it's also a lot like what you do at home. Your budget for groceries may be a little higher or lower than anticipated, but so is the heating, budget. So is, whatever your lawn care budget or the gas budget or whatever that there are a lot of different items. We might have 3 students move in who require more intensive special education services, but the most expensive outplacement comes back in district. So these things ebb and flow over the course of the year, and that's why I think having really talented people like Mike and Vin and the teams that we work with is really critical to monitor that.
Yeah, I mean, just to give a little, bit more detail. So if we have an unexpected, $50,000 increase for an outplaced student, we would look at where would we trade the money off? Is it instructional supplies? Is it in building maintenance and repairs? So we, have a budget for repairs. We have a budget for preventative maintenance. Nobody likes to touch, either side of your maintenance budget because you're just deferring maintenance. That's not a good thing, but those are the trade-off decisions that we make. And not everything goes over budget. Some items that we budget come under budget. One example, when we set our budget, which we, usually are completed with the fiscal authority approval, by the end of April, we don't necessarily have our final insurance rates for our, some of our insurance line for liability, property, casualty. So if those actual premiums are below what we budgeted, then that gives us some flexibility in our budget. So there are pluses and minuses as you go through the budget year, but we always keep an eye on, what's developing, what do we have available, and what are the trade-off decisions that need to be made to meet the budget every year.
So our next question is there a limit to how much the school budget can be cut by the city in regards to prior year?
That's the whole minimum budget requirement piece. And I would recommend, somebody take a look at the MBR flyer that was in the chat, because that kind of tells you, what the parameters are for that. Like Vin said, if your enrollment is down, then it can be reduced beyond last year's budget.
And so for us as an alliance district, Mike had mentioned this earlier, that the city cannot decrease their contribution to our budget. However, they can't decrease their contribution, but they do come up with a health number that they bill us for health. So there's been years where the city may tell us our health went up 1.6 million, and they're only giving us $1 million towards our budget. So in essence, we're losing 600,000 that we used to use directly for instruction and for educators, or more directly to kids, to pay for the benefit line. But they can't decrease that overall. And that's one of the benefits we get as Alliance District.
Yeah, but I think that speaks to the importance of the relationship between, the superintendent and the board and the fiscal authority, whether it's town council or city council or board of finance. Because even though the MBR is a technical issue, but if the board's requesting 7% and, one of the fiscal authorities wants to reduce it to 0, there's an impact to that. And so, rather than deal with the technical issue, it's, that relationship and trying to work through what are the realities. Why does the council want to cut the budget as much as they do? There's economic realities in every city and town. So, I think it's important to have good open communication lines and try and work through, the budget realities.
So I have some folks here asking if the links that you shared in the chat, if they'll be made available after the webinar. And yes, I will be sure to share that with everyone when I share the recording and the slides. Let's see. Another question is, do you post staff names in the budget books, or do you do it by position?
In Meriden, we do it by position. I mean, it's available. All staff salaries are available. Like, when we do the budget book ourselves, we do it by position.
Yeah, same in Cheshire. We post, it's pretty detailed. We don't post employee names, but we'll show the, dollar amount of, Norton classroom teachers. Norton is one of our elementary schools, or, high school number of the total dollars for the math program. It is detailed, but no names of staff.
And the other thing, I think, sometimes people go look in there to see how much money Joe Schmo makes. And it may be accurate, may not be accurate, in the sense that, Joe Schmo is also the marching band advisor. That's not going to show up for that line item in the budget book. But all of our salaries are public information. If there was a request for it, we'd provide it.
Right.
So our next question is, what does a board budget workshop look like? Are school administrators involved?
It's probably the most riveting 2 hours of anybody's life to listen to Vin talk about our budget. We kid the ones we love. But the reality is that, what we'll do is Vin said, we break it up into different segments. So when we talk about special education, our PPS director is there providing a lot of context to the numbers. Both Vin and I will provide a lot of context to the numbers. Sometimes our assistant superintendent will provide more context to the curriculum piece. But our principals attend as well to be able to provide any information there. If, like I said, the whole fencing thing, our athletic director might come and provide some background on that as well, because I think it's really important that there's a clear picture about the implications for reductions and additions is there to best support the board in making some of those really difficult decisions. So that's how we do it.
Mike, we would say we're less about having the school administrator there, more having the person who oversees the schools there. So if the board ever wanted to have a specific school come in front of them, of course, but for us, it's been more about bringing the supervisor who oversees the 8 elementary schools to answer an elementary question, or our personnel director also oversees the high schools. He would answer that. Our PPS director gets called in quite frequently, in part because special ed's a huge budget item, but in part because it's one of the tougher items to track and move, set, firm targets there as well. But I'd also say for us, when we're talking to the board about our budget, we also want them to see what the budget supports, and we want even our goals and objectives, like a good budget leads to good student results, and let's share those results with the board as well. Whenever we present the budget to the city council, we're always sharing some of the good news about the district as well. I want them to see what their investment in education means to our students and families away from the numbers. And that's always been our strategy, and something that the city council says, we need to do this more often, because that part of the meeting isn't just about dollars and cents. Ultimately, it's going to come down to them giving us a budget that they can afford, and us and the board doing the best with the resources. And the board's always been clear with the city, and it's never been a problem in my 15 years. You give us the best budget you can, we decide how we're going to use those dollars to meet the needs of our students.
And we do post the PowerPoint presentations from our workshops on the website. And if you want to watch any of our riveting presentations, as Jeff said, just you could go to our website and actually see the videotape, which I hate, frankly, but because I just don't like seeing myself on camera. But everyone, I think, does that these days.
Prepare to binge watch. You may want to set aside a Saturday. It's so compelling.
And our next question here is, what determines whether you put a line item in Alliance or the city operating budget? I understand that if you put it in the operating budget and it is cut, you then cannot use Alliance.
Go ahead, Mike. You want to take this one?
Yeah. So you're not allowed to supplant. So you're not supposed to take funding from the board budget and then move it to Alliance or any grants, because you're not supposed to supplant the board budget. But over time, as the Alliance budget now is 25 million to Meriden, right? And our city gives us $100 million, like out of this point. We got to be creative sometimes too, right? We won't take one. We'll have to create a new position so that's not the same as the old position, and kind of make it work. Or we find something else to fund in the board, the fund that we wouldn't have to cover, like technology. Almost all Meriden technology budget now is in Alliance. So we don't move staff back and forth. We do move supplies from year to year, and almost all our technology is in Alliance now. All our textbooks is in Alliance. A lot of educational supplies are in Alliance, because yes, we try not to supplant.
Yeah. I have a comment here from Sheila McKay from CABE. She says, thank you for special ed and insurance information that you went in depth on. She will be banking that for lobbying.
Okay.
Tell her thank you.
I mean, one other thing, I know it's not a question, but one other thing for transparency, we post all our documents for any of our committee meetings online, and they're up there for right now they're up there for the last 9 years. So we do have people that ask, like, every once in a while in our budget process, have you shared this information? right on our website, you could go to any of our meetings, see the agendas, and see any documents that were posted in all votes. We use a product called Board Docs, but there's a lot of other ways to do it. But I think that has helped us through the board process and just this whole, are you transparent or not? Like you could go for the last 9 years, any of our public meetings, all that information's posted. Anything like Vince said, any documents that you want to see, they're all up there.
At this moment, I don't have any other questions.
There you go, Vin.
All right, we just have a couple of wrap-up slides here.
So I had mentioned how the budget really supports our students, our staff, the school community, and I think, everyone wants to celebrate the success. Everyone wants to hear the good news, and we're proud that Israel Putnam Elementary School is one of 3 National Blue Ribbon Award winners this year. On the state's latest accountability system, we had 5 state schools of distinction. That was the 3rd most in the state. We were one of 3 districts recognized as exceptional by a recent article in the 74. And that was for 3rd grade reading proficiency. And they looked at poverty rates and how your students were doing and were you outperforming expectations. Out of the Alliance districts, we're the 3rd highest performing district. This is on proficiency or better, and on SBA grades 3 through 8, 5th highest for math. Some of our work in math was featured in the New York Times and on CBS Evening News. And most importantly to us, we have a consistent staff. We don't have great staff turnover, and over 90% of our students and 93% of our parents are pleased with our schools. And that's what it's all about.
And similarly, I wanted to highlight some of the things that we've done as a school system, in terms of our accomplishments, but also, some of the highlights for the board. They've been a CADE Board of Distinction the last 2 years. Norton, like Mark said, we were Blue Ribbon School in 2020, Norton Elementary School. We have the best overall Smarter Balanced performance, math and English combined, and DIRG B. We've shown tremendous growth in our Smarter Balanced performance and niche rankings and things like that. But I wanted to highlight the last few, the effort we've made to improve our mental health staffing ratios after we identified social emotional learning as a key goal. We took a look at our budget, and that's what I was talking about with respect to, does your budget reflect your values? And we recognize that, our ratios were some of the worst in the DIRG, most students per mental health provider, and to the board's credit and the community's credit, they reinvested in that area. And so I think that's one of those areas where you can see where our money reflects our values. We instituted the first teen mental health first aid program in a Connecticut high school a few years back. And I think we're also really proud of the board's efforts in the Bounce Forward plan, we called it. We had that money. We didn't want to bounce back from the pandemic. We wanted to become better from what we learned through the pandemic. So we invested a lot of money in professional development and avoided fiscal cliffs as a result. And like Meriden, we had a phase in for some of the additional supports that frankly we were going to have to add anyway with the growing enrollment in the elementary schools. But appreciate the board's foresight there, kind of working together, recognizing we wanted to avoid a fiscal cliff. And so again, I think it's just a lot of planning with the board, a lot of coherence around, what our values are and what we're trying to become to really help the budget process.
So it's exactly 1:15, and I wanted to just mention and thank all the board members who attended today, and all the board members for the service that they provide, at no cost to our school district. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
I guess we're done.